using Visual Studio. And what we're gonna do is we fire up Visual Studio, and then we're gonna pick SQL Server Database project. This type of project is going to allow us to maintain the definition of a SQL Server database inside a Visual Studio project. I just click on create, and after I click on create, I'm going to switch the window here. Visual Studio shows up with the Solution Explorer on the side, and it shows here my SQL Server project. So one of the first things I do is that I create a few folders to organize my code. Do tables, then store procedures, and I'm gonna add a table. So the first thing I'm gonna be adding is a students table. So a table that's gonna hold information about each student, and a student is gonna be one row per student. So do table students. And notice that Visual Studio has, by default, a little bit of code, starter code for us. It already defines this ID for the student as a primary key. We're gonna be changing a little bit that a little bit, but let's say we could do last name, and then varchar, and then for now we're just gonna stick to varchar. It probably would be more appropriate to do varchar to allow Unicode characters on the names, but for simplicity's sake, I'm gonna just keep it as varchar. Do first name, I'm gonna use the same thing, varchar 50. Not null. Another thing to keep in mind is that try your columns. Most of your columns should not be nullable. That's just a best practice. Unless, of course, the business domain demands to be nullable. But even downstream, when your data flows into the different programming languages, like any programming language in .NET or Java, you want to prevent the database from giving too many nulls downstream. Again, it depends on the domain problem, but if you can avoid nulls, do so. So notice here that I repeated varchar 50 and varchar 50 here. Another thing I like to do, and it's one of the best practice, is that instead of just giving these types inline to the columns and then just anywhere we want to do last name, we just keep remembering this varchar 50, we can create what's called a user-defined type. A user-defined type is going to allow us to give a meaning to that type, and it's in my opinion, is a good practice to do. That way your column is not just a string, it's not just a varchar 50, it's actually something more than that. It's an actually domain type. In this case, it could be a name. So let's do a new folder for let's call it UDTs, which is user-defined types. Do add, and I'm going to click on new item. And I'm going to search for type, and I'm going to make sure I don't pick the CLR type, but pick the transact SQL script for type. I'm going to name this type name. Actually, call it name or name part. And then I'm going to give it varchar 50 and not null. So now that I have that, I can reference that type here. So instead of being a varchar 50, it's actually a name part. So that now gives a little bit more meaning, it makes it more readable. It's not just a varchar 50s, it's actually a name part. And if I need to change that, I can change it just here. If I want to change the definition of that type, I can just change that just here and it will replicate everywhere else. Same thing with the age. We could do age, and we could go here and do as an integer, but instead of that, we're gonna do another type. I'm gonna say add new item type, and we're gonna create a new I'm gonna name it person age. And I'm gonna use that in my table. Save this, use that in my table. So now I have person age. Now notice that one of the things I didn't have to do is check the allow null check mark, because the type, the definition of the type tells it that it's a not null. So you get that piece of information with the types as well. Here the ID be not null, we're gonna change that to be an identity column. To do that, what we have to do is we're gonna go to the properties, and to just pop up the properties, I'm just gonna hit F4, and I'm gonna tell it that it is a compute column. I'm sorry, not compute, an identity specification, and I'm gonna tell it yes, it's an identity, and I want to increment by 1, and that's gonna give us our automatic ID. And instead of ID, I'm gonna call it student ID, and instead of just integer, I'm gonna also use a user-defined type. I'm gonna use student type. So I'm gonna click on new type, new item, and I'm gonna go user-defined type. It's already selected. I'm gonna go student ID. Go to add, and then I'm gonna save this, and I'm gonna use it here. And even as a user-defined type, you can still use it as an identity. The next thing to do is to create a store procedure to add students. Oh, I got a squiggle here. Must be a data type integer. Okay. And that's because here is a varchar, so we'll just change it to integer. One of the things I like to do with subprocedures is that your subprocedures should encapsulate a specific business action, not just something like add student or delete student. It should be more of what the business action represents. In this case, it could be enroll student in school. So I'm just going to create another subprocedure and say sp enroll student. Click on add. I'm just gonna here really quick. I'm gonna do last name, and it's a name part. First name, so a name part, and age, which is a person age. So I'm gonna tell it that I want to insert that into students. Last name, first name, age, and I want last name, first name as the values, and age. Save that, and then I'm going to publish that. So right now, all the changes that we have been doing here, they're still inside Visual Studio, inside our file system. They're actually not on a server yet. Well, technically they are in a special instance, internal instance of local DB. But if we want to publish it to a server, let's say my local SQL Express server, I have to right-click on the project and click on publish. And there are different ways of doing this, but I'm just showing the UI way of doing this. So I hit right-click publish, and it says that it cannot build because it has to build successfully. So there's an error, and just like any Visual Studio project, you can see the error on the error list. So it's telling us that the it has to be of type int, big int, small int, with a scale of 0, and the count must not be null. Okay, and that's probably because of the user defined type. So let me just change that here. So I might have been wrong about that. So I'm gonna click on integer here, and let me try to publish that again. Yep. So here, when I click on publish, when I right click and choose publish, it's gonna give me a dialog for where to put the database. So I'm just gonna create a target connection. And I'm going to, oh, I just realized that you're not seeing that. Let me add that window here. I'm going here, I'm gonna add a window. On the file on OBS, window capture, new OBS publish. So now you see there's a window here, and I'm gonna pick that server, SQL Express. I'm just gonna name it with that database name. I'm gonna click OK. And when I click OK, it takes me back. Well, it's not showing here, but I'm gonna add that window to a stream. Let's see. Here we go, publish database. So this is the publish dialog, and the window I was before came up when I click on edit. In this window, I can tell it, that shows the connection stream, the database name, and what I can do is I'm gonna save the profile. So next time I can just pick a profile to publish. So I'm gonna save the profile as, I'm gonna do -test, save that, and then I can either generate the script that's gonna give me the SQL to push, or I can click on publish. I'm gonna click on publish this time. So when I click on publish, Visual Studio is gonna attempt to publish the database to my local database. And while it's publishing, I'm gonna try to connect to a database from here. I'm gonna try SQL Server Object Explorer. And I'm gonna add a new SQL Server. And when I add a new SQL Server, I want the SQL Express instance. So the polishing is still working out. We're gonna wait for it to finish. And then when we are here, this typically doesn't take that much longer.